Again, good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Kelly Maynard and I'm a Cooperative Development Specialist with the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives. And today we're going to be learning about Cooperative Board self-evaluation. This is the first of two in our spring 2021 governance webinar series. A few housekeeping items before we begin. The webinar today will run for about 60 minutes. Your phone lines are muted, and the format today will be a presentation of about 35 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. We have the questions that you submitted during registration, and we'll do our best to answer them, the ones that pertain to today's topic. And you can also submit questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A box that you should see in your control panel at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted to our website, uwcc.wisc.edu, and the link will also be made available in the follow-up email that we send after the conclusion of the webinar. The UW Center for Cooperatives is based on UW-Madison campus. We began these semi-annual directors forums in 2015. They are typically in person, although a year ago we shifted to this virtual format, the silver lining of which is we get to be participants from all around the country are able to join. Our center was founded in 1962, and we do research, education, and outreach on the cooperative business model across all sectors and ownership types. Today's presenter is our executive director, Courtney Berner. Courtney first joined the center in 2011 and served as a cooperative development specialist until assuming the role of executive director in January of 2018. Courtney develops research, outreach, and education programs on cooperatives and provides support to new and established cooperatives in a wide range of industries. Cooperative governance has become one of her widely recognized areas of expertise. She speaks on a range of governance topics to cooperative leaders, cooperative developers, and students, and was a key content contributor to a recently released online course for agricultural cooperative directors called Governance Foundations. Her most recent, really exciting governance-related project is spearheading the Cooperative Governance Research Initiative, which is the first national cross-sector survey of cooperative governance practices. Just a reminder that throughout the presentation today, you can put questions in the Q&A and we will do our best to answer those at the end. Now I'll turn it over to Courtney.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you, talking about one of my favorite governance topics, which is about board evaluation. It's such a critical piece of being an effective board, taking time to reflect on what we're doing well, where we can improve, and how to just be the most effective team we can be working on behalf of our members. So I'm really excited to hear your questions and to share some content and have a conversation about this important topic. So before we do that, it's always fun to get a sense of who's in the room. So I just launched a poll. If you could respond, which sector best describes your cooperative? So we've got a bunch of sectors there. And if you could answer, we've got one from housing, and then, both questions popped up. Getting fancy. Wasn't sure they would do that. There's two questions. So first question is sector. Second question is, when did your board last complete a self-evaluation? And there's, not sure, you might be a new director, or maybe you've never done one. All answers are okay. So I'll give you another 15 seconds to respond. And then we will end the poll so you can see. All right, so looks like we have 6 co-ops from AGS, that's our leading sector, and then a really great distribution across sectors, arts and crafts, credit unions, healthcare, manufacturing, and then others. So thanks so much. One of the fun things about these director programs that we do is that we do attract co-ops from a wide range of sectors. And so it's a great opportunity to learn from people and with people from other parts of the co-op community that you might not already know. So when did your board last complete a self-evaluation? I realize I didn't share the results, so now you can see them. So the leading answer is I'm not sure. That's okay. I'm so glad you're here. The next leading answer is we've never done one. So that's great. You're in the right place to have a conversation about how to get started. And then looks like a couple of you have done one within the last 6 months. Maybe you have some lessons to share with us. And some who maybe did one a handful of years ago. So great. All right, thanks so much. That gives me a good sense of where folks are at in the room. So, all right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm gonna close that poll. So next slide, Kelly. So today I plan to cover really why do we conduct board evaluations, and then how do we conduct board evaluations? And we'll spend a lot more time on the how, of course. But after the webinar today, I hope that you leave with the ability to articulate the role that board evaluations play in assessing and improving board culture and performance, and that you understand both the process and some of the different methods for conducting board evaluations and what the pros and cons might be of those different approaches. So next slide, please. So before we talk about the why, the how, I want to spend a little bit of time on the why, because if we don't understand the why, sometimes it's harder to get to actually implementing the process. It just seems like another thing to do on a long list of things to do when you're on a cooperative board. So board evaluations, as I mentioned in my introduction, are really a critical component of good governance. A good board evaluation process provides an opportunity for directors to reflect on their personal contributions in the boardroom and to identify areas of board operations or culture or processes that might need attention or improvement. Regular board evaluations, when done well, should build trust and respect amongst board members and between the board and management. They should also help directors more effectively work as a team, since if we don't know, where we shine and where we might need to improve, it's a little bit harder to work towards being a really, a very highly effective team. So some of the things that board evaluations are not for, so we don't conduct them to shame or wield power over other directors, nor do we conduct them simply to check a box. And just say, yep, we do that every year. Checking a box without having a meaningful process isn't really going to achieve the results that you're probably looking for. Like all good governance tools that we talk about in these sessions, the board evaluation process should contribute to making the board as effective as possible for the benefit of members and the other stakeholders, whether it's staff, management, members of our community that we, co-ops exist to serve. So that's the why. Let's move on to the how. So this is just an overview of the steps in the evaluation process. The first step, which may seem obvious, but is really important, is that you gain commitment to the process from all of the board members, and that you communicate to the board the importance of taking the evaluation process seriously, taking time to really engage thoughtfully in the process. Because if that doesn't happen, if directors aren't motivated to engage with the process, or if they're afraid to share honest feedback, it will be a waste of time. So thinking through, how do we create a process that where people feel comfortable sharing their honest feedback, making sure that there's some level of anonymity in the responses. So once you have that buy-in from the board and a commitment to moving forward with conducting an evaluation, the next steps are to determine the evaluation criteria, the timeline, and the process. And once those are set, the evaluation is conducted, the results are analyzed and then shared with and discussed by the full board. And if there are areas of improvement that are identified, a plan should then be developed to address those areas. So now we're going to dig into each step in the process. Next slide, please. So once you've got commitment from the board to move forward with the process, you need evaluation criteria. That's a fancy way of saying, what will the board evaluation process actually measure? What are we trying to understand about ourselves as individuals of this board and as a group? So you can use a dozen different categories for criteria. I mean, I've both written and reviewed a lot of board evaluation surveys, and there are a lot of different ways to sort of slice the pie. For simplicity's sake today, I have lumped the criteria into 3 broad buckets. The first of which is core board functions, the second is board systems, and the third is board culture. But again, there are a lot of different ways to do this, and likely in your survey, you'll have a larger number of categories that are a little bit more specific. So for each bucket that we'll go through today, I've included some general categories as well as some sample questions, just to sort of plant the seeds of what you might think about in terms of things you would potentially ask. But there, again, are a lot of different ways to do this. So they're just examples. So regardless of which categories you use, or which questions you use, or which evaluation criteria you set, ultimately, the evaluation criteria should help the board answer the following sort of overarching questions. How well are directors carrying out their duties? What are our areas of strength as a board? What are our areas of weakness, or maybe growth areas, to frame it a little more positively? And how can the board improve its performance and be more effective? So those are sort of, all questions should hopefully lead to answering those broader objectives. And I think anytime you're doing survey design, and again, if you have someone external who's doing this work for you, this may not, they probably know this, but only ask questions where you think you can really, use the data. Like for anyone taking a survey, if I get a survey and I'm like, it's taking me 10, 15, 20 minutes and I'm only like a quarter of the way through the questions, I can see that little progress bar. I get discouraged. So, really making sure that you're focusing on the things that matter the most, and leaving the other things aside. All right, next slide. So the first area is core board functions. Is the board providing adequate financial oversight? Is the board adhering to its policies and effectively monitoring the CEO or general manager or the management team? Is the board communicating sufficiently with members? How focused is the board on strategy and mission, as opposed to maybe getting caught up in the weeds of operations? So like I said, there's some sort of general categories on the left, and then some sample questions on the right that address some of the key topics in this area. So, the board receives regular financial reports that allow the board to monitor financial goals. The board assesses the CEO's performance in a systematic and fair way on a regular basis. I'm not going to read all of these, but you get the idea. So having some questions that directors are able to sort of rank how effectively they think the board is doing these things. The next area, so next slide, board systems, that's sort of the second bucket. So how productive are meetings? Are decisions well documented? Are directors able to easily locate the documents and information that they need to do their jobs? Sometimes a board member or a board is not functioning highly because they're not paying attention, or they're busy, they're not prioritizing the work, and sometimes they really just aren't getting the tools that they need in order to do their jobs effectively. So if any of you manage people in your jobs, when you do performance evaluations, if someone is maybe underperforming, it's really important to understand why, what's leading to that underperformance. And often it doesn't have to do with the person, it may have to do with what that person, the tools, resources, that person is being given to do their job. So same applies in the case of a board. Really understanding if there are issues, what the underlying causes of those issues are. So other questions, do board packets arrive in a timely manner with the right information? How effective and efficient are the systems of communication between the directors and between the directors and the co-op's management? So the sample questions on the right, similar to the ones on the previous slide, would be used in something called like a Likert scale, which in other words, directors would be asked to indicate to what degree they agree or disagree with the following statements. It's one way of posing questions in a survey. So it's a good idea in the evaluation to have a mix of questions, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. These Likert style questions or ranking questions take less time to complete, and they make it easy to compare evaluation results over time. So if you're doing this every year and using the same questions, you can monitor progress or areas where you sort of might be slipping and that need some attention. So, those questions are good for some reasons, and then open-ended questions really allow for more nuanced responses that may address more specific issues that are going on and allow for a little bit more detail to be shared. All right, let's go to the third bucket, board culture. So the evaluation should include questions related to the culture of the board. And what do I mean by culture? So culture is the way that a group thinks, acts, and interacts. It's often there are parts of our culture that are seen and most of it that's unseen. It's just the way that we interact with one another. And so sometimes new directors coming onto a board may see things that the board doesn't see itself anymore because it's just sort of been normalized. And they may also not understand some of the underlying cultural dynamics that exist. I really encourage groups to have some questions that get at the culture of the board. So things like, do directors respect their peers and feel respected in return? Do directors feel comfortable speaking up in a board meeting when they have a dissenting viewpoint? How open are directors to new ideas, to new perspectives? Things like that. How well prepared are board members when they're coming to meetings? Sometimes people feel a little less comfortable answering these questions, but I just think that they're really, really important. And especially as we, as co-ops, are working, as all organizations are working to be more diverse and more inclusive. It's one thing to achieve your diversity goals, but if you're not also creating an inclusive environment, that work might be in vain. So really good to check in on a lot of these issues. And one of my favorite Peter Drucker quotes is, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I just, even the best systems and processes and structures and intentions can be derailed if you have an unhealthy culture that's developing and people don't feel comfortable bringing, really being an active voice in their cooperative board. So, all right, next slide, please. So next I want to talk about the evaluation process. So there's the what are we going to measure? What questions are we going to ask? And then there's the how and when will we measure and how will we do this evaluation? So the process includes sort of 4 key components that are all interconnected, hence this circle around the process circle. So timing, collection methods, types of evaluation, and facilitation. And these, like I said, are all interconnected. So for example, the type of evaluation you choose to conduct may influence your collection methods and potentially the frequency with which you conduct evaluations. And whether you bring in, the types of evaluation questions you ask may influence, whether you want to bring someone in from the outside to facilitate the process or keep the whole process in-house. So I'll walk through the 4 different components of the process next. So types of evaluation. So in addition to thinking about the evaluation criteria, or what do we want to measure, it must be decided sort of what types of questions will be asked and how that data will be collected. There are essentially three different types kind of evaluations. So full board evaluations focus on the performance of the board as a whole group, like as a board. And most of those questions that I included in the sample questions are sort of full board evaluation oriented questions, and quite common. This is a very common way of doing board evaluation. Self-evaluations ask directors to contemplate their personal contributions in to sort of the work and the culture of the board. And often a board evaluation will have a mix of, like, what I've seen done very commonly is most of the questions are sort of full board evaluation type questions. And then there may be a section that's really for self-evaluation, or, you know, in each bucket, most of the questions are oriented towards the full board, and there might be a question or two for individuals to reflect on how they're doing, what their contributions, understanding, whatever might be in that specific category. Lastly, peer evaluations ask directors to comment on the performance of their fellow directors. Like I said, it's very common for boards to include evaluation questions that focus on the board as a whole and on sort of individual contributions. It is less common for boards to use peer evaluations. This is, you know, probably not surprising to any of you. I would argue that peer evaluation can be a really healthy practice when implemented with care. So thinking through confidentiality, thinking through how do we really understand individual director performance, and do it in a way that is leading to positive improvement as opposed to factions or blaming. You know, one of the things that we've come across sort of as we've been getting ready to do this cooperative governance survey and looking at other surveys and other reports that have reflected on governance practices in specific sectors. There are often not great methods for dealing with underperforming directors or like systems in place in co-ops. Many co-ops lack that. Once a director is, you know, on the board, they may get reelected or not, but like that isn't always tied to their performance. And one of the few ways of actually getting at, you know, who is doing the work and showing up is this peer evaluation. So it's uncomfortable. Not that many co-ops that I'm familiar with do it, but I actually think it can be a really good practice. Because, you know, one thing that happens when some director, you know, a group of directors is doing most of the work and another set of directors maybe, or maybe a single director isn't participating as much, that eventually leads to resentment and some other unfortunate dynamics that ultimately impact that board's effectiveness and cohesiveness as a team. So I'll stop there. I also want to mention that often boards will conduct an evaluation of the board chair or the board president. So sometimes that's conducted separately as a totally separate process, and but it could also be conducted in conjunction with the regular board evaluation. So, but I think that's another important piece of evaluating the overall effectiveness of the board. So most board evaluations are sort of moving on to collection methods. And I still talk with my hands a lot, even though I'm on Zoom. I've discovered this in the last year. Talking with your hands doesn't go away, even if you're talking just to a screen, turns out. So moving on to collection methods, most board evaluations are conducted using a written survey that includes a mix of open-ended questions and questions that ask directors to rate or rank rate various aspects of the board's performance and their own performance. So like I said earlier, you know, open-ended questions are helpful in that they give directors an opportunity to provide more nuanced feedback that addresses specific challenges or frustrations or opportunities that don't fit neatly into a rating scale. the rating scale questions are really limited in that way. But the primary advantage of rating type questions is that the board's performance and progress can be tracked over time. They're a little easier to fill out. And you can address quite a few issues pretty quickly through that type of question. So occasionally a board will use interviews as well to collect feedback on performance. Probably not every year, but we might do a deeper dive on performance one year and use interviews. And if those are used, I strongly recommend hiring an outside consultant to facilitate that process, just to make sure that the feedback that then is making it to the full board is delivered in a way that is constructive and useful and productive, and not sort of divisive or just creating more problems than it solved. All right, so on to the other parts of the evaluation process. If I can get the next slide, Cal, thank you. So on the topic of facilitation, the group also needs to decide from the outset, like, who's going to lead this process? Do we want it to be internal or external? And there are several options for managing the process internally. So the board might appoint a small committee or a single well-respected director to sort of plan and facilitate this process. I think that the board evaluation process is something that is really a great process to be managed by a committee, especially if you're thinking about hiring an outside facilitator. That committee can sort of, get its charge from the board, go out, research a couple people, come up with a process, run that process by the full board. But really that sort of can be some detailed work that may not need to be managed by the whole board. When I've worked with groups on board evaluations, I often end up working with the board chair. That's typically who reaches out to me, and then I'll work with them on putting together sort of a proposal and sort of a draft survey. And I strongly encourage them to engage more people from their board in the conversation, but it's also normal for the board chair to sort of manage that process. If your board has a board administrator, I know that there are a lot of boards out there, a lot of co-ops that are not at the scale where that's a dream, it's not a reality. But if you do have a board administrator, they could also play a role in terms of managing the process, potentially facilitating. But it's important to be aware of sort of the potential pitfalls of that arrangement. The board administrator may not have experience administering surveys, probably is not the appropriate person to deliver the evaluation results and the follow-up conversation, especially if the evaluation reveals some challenging dynamics that need to be addressed. And the board administrator typically reports to the board, so they might be hesitant or uncomfortable with managing the process given the power dynamics at play. I do discourage board chairs from facilitating the process themselves. I just think creating an environment where everyone feels comfortable participating in that follow-up conversation, it's fine. It's just, I do think there are some advantages to having someone else. However, if you do separate out that board chair evaluation process from the full board evaluation, then maybe that's less of an issue. But all that is to say, there's a lot of ways to manage it internally. Just keep in mind sort of the issues of confidentiality, or wanting to make sure that people creating a process that is robust, that people feel comfortable and motivated to participate in, that stays sort of on track, on time, and that has some follow through. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So it's also very common to hire an outside consultant to develop and administer the survey, to then analyze the results and participate in or really lead a follow-up conversation. That's a role that I've certainly played with boards, and it can be helpful to have someone like me, and I'm not trying to pitch my services at all. We don't charge very much for it, but to have someone from the outside who really doesn't have a conflict of interest in terms of what shows up, like my my desire when engaging in a process with a board is to help them become the most effective team that they can become, and to, you know, unearth things that are going well and celebrate those, and unearth things that are not going well, and be real honest about how to address those. So sometimes having a person who's not being evaluated, who can come in and have a candid conversation is really useful. So yeah, the neutral third part, outside person is sort of a neutral third party who can also, you know, you've hired them and committed to a timeline. So the likelihood of moving it along on the timeline that you had proposed is pretty high too. So when thinking about hiring someone to engage in this process with you, it's important to make sure that they have experience with survey design and analysis, and that they're skilled at facilitating productive follow-up conversations. You could hire someone to design the survey and not be part of the final conversation. That's fine too. But those are sort of two skill sets that I would look for. And a good outside consultant will work with the board leadership or the evaluation committee, or whoever is sort of managing the process, to develop an evaluation tool and process and a format that's really tailored to the board's specific needs and preferences. Of course, I would say the main disadvantage of hiring someone from the outside is that it is rarely free, but there's a wide range of cost out there. So the timing is also another issue. So the board needs to decide how often to conduct evaluations. And this decision will be influenced sort of in part by how robust and time consuming the process they choose is. So if you're like, we're gonna hire we haven't done this ever, we want to hire an outside consultant to come in and maybe do some interviews and a survey, and then really have like a long and strategic conversation about what's going on. You know, that's going to be maybe not something you want to repeat every year. Maybe you repeat this, you know, you get a really great survey instrument in place that you feel good about, and maybe, you know, you do that every year, but you really don't go do the full deep dive each year. And you know, peer evaluations, does that happen every year? I just think, like, as you think about what do we want to include, thinking about how often to do it. In some boards, there's pretty quick turnover, and other boards, there's very little turnover. That might also impact how often you want to do this. If you've had the same 9 board members for the last 15 years, one could argue that's you know, that means maybe you should do it every year, or you could do it less frequently. So I think just being really intentional and mindful of it, and not avoiding engaging in the process because you think you might get answers you don't like. I would argue that that's, you know, all the more reason to engage in the process. So, you know, some co-ops will alternate again between doing a really simple survey with a more robust evaluation process every few years. But I do, in order to not like let it fall off the radar, because it's, you know, we're all busy, things get lost in this shuffle. If you have a board calendar, if you don't have a board calendar, create a board calendar. If you do have a board calendar, add the annual evaluation process to the calendar. So it's like you do it every year at the same time. It's sort of triggered like the CEO or GM evaluation, or other sort of, or the annual meeting, these things that are just like built in and become habit because you do them every year. So, and then, you know, it really is, it's not the general manager's responsibility to make sure that the board evaluates itself. It's really the board is responsible for its own sort of development. So that includes education, that includes evaluation. So really it's the board's responsibility to make sure that this happens. I can guarantee you that your CEO or general manager, if you have one, would really like the board to engage in this practice, but it is, and they might have asked you about it, or they might have encouraged it, but it is not in fact their job, in their job description, to make sure that you do it. So just want to emphasize that. So the last sort of, I'm sure there are other things we could talk about in terms of the process, but the last question that I'm going to talk about is sort of, who gets to see the results? How are we going to share them? Who gets to see them? Will they be available to just the board? or will the CEO and other senior management have access to the report? Do we share them with the members? I've never heard of board evaluation results being shared with a broader membership. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It may. I'd be curious to hear if those of you who have done evaluations in the last 5 years have ever shared them with the full membership. It's a tricky question because you're trying to think about what's going to lead to the best outcome in terms of this board being highly effective, and what's going to lead to an evaluation process that's going to be meaningful and where people are going to share their real thoughts. Because if people are like, oh, well, I'm worried that the members, I'm worried to say anything bad about the member or about our board because, we might be judged for that and we need to work on this thing, but I don't want anyone to know about it. Or, I just think that really thinking through and talking about it up front, making a decision ahead of time during your planning, not after you have all the results, but before you've done the survey, before you've done the evaluation, so that everyone understands who will be seeing the results, how the process, the discussion will be facilitated, so that folks know going in where the information they're sharing will be going. All right, next slide. So one of the most meaningful steps, we've talked a lot about the prep, how do we actually conduct the evaluation, but without this last step, and we know this as cooperators, if we ask members for their input on something, it's really important to circle back around and show that A, we listened, and B, we're taking their input seriously, and C, this is what we're doing about it. The same is true with an evaluation. If, everyone completes the survey, you get the results via email, there's maybe a 5-minute, oh, does anyone want to talk about this at the board, at the board meeting, and that's it. I think you've just probably wasted quite a bit of time on a process if there aren't meaningful steps in place to really talk about the results. So super important to have some follow-up. This is especially true if the evaluation reveals some difficult dynamics or areas that need improvement. So again, really decide from the outset, how are we going to structure this discussion? Will we have it as part of a long conversation, as part of a board meeting? There's a co-op that I've worked with quite a bit on board evaluation, and we build this conversation into their annual board retreat. It's actually part of the conversation each year is reporting on the board evaluation and areas where things are going well. And it's been great, actually, in that case, some things, really improve from year to year, and then other things pop up. We're like, oh, we've sort of let that, we haven't paid enough attention to that. So, and I encourage boards to focus on strengths and weaknesses, celebrate what's working. This isn't just about finding things that are wrong. It's oh, these are things we're doing really well. Yay, let's pat ourselves on the back, but then also making concrete plans for addressing areas that need improvement. So, good boards continually strive for improvement. It's an ongoing process. We're always needing to reflect as individuals and as a board about the work that we're doing, how we're serving our co-op, how we're serving members. And I think that board evaluation is a great tool for raising and finding solutions. So I hope this gave you a better sense of why board evaluations are important and how to get started in the process. And I will stop now and just take questions. So.
Thanks, Courtney. I will share a few of the questions that came in both over the Q&A and registration. One of the questions is about advantages and disadvantages of preserving anonymity of respondents, especially between individual directors.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it's actually one that you face with any kind of evaluation. So I did a 360 evaluation. I had my team evaluate me after my first year and a half in my current job. And like, you know, one of the things is you want anonymity allows people maybe to say it's like a double-edged sword. It's like, does it free people? Think about like comments on the internet. Can lead to some really great conversations, or it can lead to people maybe sharing feedback in a way that they would never share it if they had to sit face to face with someone and share it. So I think, you know, a survey, I've seen it go both ways. I've seen, you know, people ask to include their names. I think if you're hiring an outside consultant, what can be nice is the person can, you know, collect that information, and they can then just report on the aggregate, so that when I've worked with groups, I've reported on the results, but I don't share who said what comments. That's been, you know, so people get to hear sort of the raw feedback, but they don't, their names aren't revealed. So I think in general, anonymity is a good thing. Hopefully your board is functional enough and people have enough respect for each other that like that actually just leads to deeper, more meaningful conversations, having the ability to keep it anonymous. I think where then, and it, you know, it's important to have a conversation afterwards is people can then voice, you know, specific concerns that they maybe had, or they could say, yeah, that was my comment actually, and this is something that I'm really have struggled with and I would really like us to address. So another, if you're doing interviews, obviously those are not going to be anonymous. And I think with a peer evaluation, it gets a little trickier. But again, like no one has you know, no one's like employed by each other. Like you're really accountable to members and you're accountable to each other. So framing up the conversation and the process, you know, like this is a self-improvement activity and a, you know, group dynamic improvement activity. It's not meant to like shame anyone. You know, we're not going to like send your grade to the members. So I think that that's where the framing really is important. So there's pros and cons to both sides, but generally keeping things anonymous, I think, is the better way to go.
So this builds on that question. What if you have an underperforming board member or members causing a problem in a particular area? Any suggestions for how to depersonalize the feedback?
Yeah.
Things that come through.
Oh gosh, I default. So there's a couple things. One, really trying to understand what the root cause is, not assuming that you fully understand. So what I've seen, and not like calling someone out maybe in a board meeting. So a really an appropriate thing might be for the board chair to set up a call. You know, pre-COVID, you'd set up maybe having a cup of coffee. Someday, again, we'll do that. But setting up a conversation and just saying, hey, you know, I've noticed X, Y, or Z dynamic is happening. I would just like to better understand, you know, what's going on, you know. Maybe it's not the board chair, maybe there's issues between the board chair and that person. Maybe it's someone else who's, you know, close to that director, and just sort of checks in. That's a softer approach. Sometimes, you know, you never know what's going on in someone's life or what's driving that behavior. So before there are any sort of accusations made, I think it's important to go there first, sort of person to person. But, you know, if it is really just like someone is being really difficult and it doesn't seem like, you know, that softer route is helping, I do think having, you know, a board evaluation process where there's a peer evaluation might unearth some of those things in a way that people might not feel comfortable. I mean, let's be real, like in the upper Midwest, people aren't always as direct, or like people that like to avoid, not everyone, not to make any assumptions, but like there's a lot of conflict aversion. And so, you know, can you use the process sometimes what can be nice about a board, even in a whole board evaluation, without naming names, it can be, it can maybe, you can find out that like there's this difficult dynamic that may be caused by one person, but then you're able to talk about the dynamic. So it shows up in the results and you're able to say, okay, well, not everyone feels comfortable sharing their opinion or speaking up if they have a dissenting opinion because they kind of feel shut down. Like, let's try to understand what's going on. And that's another way. And I think, this is more like interpersonal psychology. This is probably why I like governance so much, is it's a lot about interpersonal dynamics. It's, talking about how something impacts you as opposed to saying like, you're a bad person or you're doing this thing, or, it's like, I feel like I have a hard time speaking up in board meetings because I feel like I'm instantly going to be criticized. How can we find a way to interact where like, I don't feel that way? So sort of making it about how you're feeling and how it maybe impacts your ability to contribute in the boardroom. So those are some suggestions. Who's on the board? This is one of the things we're really trying to understand in this governance survey, is like, who's on the board can really impact how successful you are. Again, culture and who's in those seats in some ways is just as important, if not more important, than the structures and processes in place. So yeah.
Thanks. So a question that gets to a past forum that we did in the winter about governance continuity. Should the results of these evaluations kind of be held for a certain amount of time and potentially passed on to future board members?
Good question. So, whether or not it's relevant, like, if you are in a co-op board where there's a lot of turnover pretty regularly, and maybe like an evaluation from 3 years ago, there's like half the people are gone, you get new board members every year. Or every couple of years, is that relevant? Maybe, maybe not. What I find interesting and why it can be useful to get a really good survey in place initially is that then, what I've done with groups where I've done board evaluations over a number of years is we actually benchmark, so we can look back, like, oh, in 2017, this is how things were rated, and you can actually compare year over year. So we're like dropping the comments from the previous years, but at least looking at those broader metrics of performance and looking at trend lines. So I think having them in your files is not, like in your board files, is not a bad thing at all. But reflecting again on how relevant they are to the current board. If you're doing it year over year, I think that can be useful, so like, just like you'd compare your budget, how you're performing financially, compare it to previous years, being able to look at the results of your board evaluation in the context of the dynamics that emerged in the last 2 or 3 years can be useful.
So you, at the beginning, highlighted the importance of gaining commitment from the board members to doing the self-evaluation. Mm-hmm. And how do you do this when the board directors are elected by co-op members? And then kind of, yeah, that was the question. How do you do this when board directors are elected by the co-op?
How do you gain buy-in?
Yeah, the commitment to this particular self-evaluation process.
I think it's a board leadership issue. It's like, how do you get the board to do anything? So if, I think it's the responsible thing to do as a board. I think making sure that, one of your roles, and I mentioned this as a board, is your own development, your own performance. And so, if you are going to work on behalf of members, I think it's important that boards are monitoring their own performance and how they're doing. So, if you're a board chair, if you're a board member on a board and like you think you might meet some resistance, this is what I tell people a lot. I'm like, tell them you just went to a webinar where this person told me that it's best practice to do board evaluations. I think that like it's some people hate performance evaluations at the end of the year. I'm one of those like strange birds who actually likes them, because I think that when done well, like evaluation conversations are really about growth and about self-reflection and about the future and how do we do things. That's how I approach performance evaluations with our team. It's like, okay, how did the last year go? How are we doing? What things do we need to pay attention to? And like, okay, what are we going to do in the coming year? How do we do our best work? And so I just think that how you frame it up, and there may be resistance to paying an outside director, an outside consultant to do it. That's fine. You can, have a committee or have a person who puts together the survey. That is better than doing nothing. So, and I think, if back to the question about like, well, you're elected by members, if the members, I think it's good to be able to tell the members that you take your role seriously, and part of that is evaluating your performance every year. And when I was on Willie Street's board, I used to say to myself, like, as I was making a decision, how would I feel standing in front of the entire membership and telling them what decision I made? How would I feel about that? And so if you've never ever done a board evaluation, that's okay. But how would you feel if the members are like, well, how's the board doing? I'm unhappy with the board. And you're like, well, we've never done a self-evaluation. I don't really know. So I just think it's a good practice. You can send them to me too. I'd be happy to get on my soapbox and talk to them.
An idea that occurs to me that, if you're just getting started with board evaluations, maybe it's hard, but, if there's some sort of, when people run for the board and then, are elected to the board, if there's some sort of like, board code of conduct, board, member commitment kind of thing, having it on there as part of one of the board's responsibilities, so that it's very clear, like when you're signing on to be a director, this is one of the things you're signing on to agree to do. Could be so it's just very, it's in writing, the expectation that it's part of what happens.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And that once you get it, like, it might be hard to do the process once, but like if you spend some time creating a really good process, then you just repeat the process. It's easier to redo a process than to create it from scratch. So it's an investment.
So another question, how does the board evaluate if they are accurately and effectively representing the membership? I can think of conducting interviews with some members, maybe focus groups.
Yeah, great question. I think I don't know. That's like, if you could answer that question, that I wish I could answer that question. I don't really know. I think a little bit of that depends on, so some of it, it's like core duties. Okay, are we doing like the absolutely essential things as a board and safeguarding the well-being of the cooperative on behalf of members? I think something that can pair nicely with a board evaluation tool or survey is a member survey, a member satisfaction survey. And actually this co-op that I mentioned earlier, I'm not going to mention my name, but that I've done quite a bit of board evaluation work with. It's a worker cooperative. And we do an annual retreat every year, or about every year. And in addition to having the board self-evaluation results that we look at every year, every couple of years, there's a member survey. And we also review that. And there are, that's a window into, so it's like, okay, well, how satisfied is the membership with the cooperative? And if there are areas of dissatisfaction, as a board, what's our role in addressing some of those, or directing management to address those? So I think member surveys, again, when crafted really well, are another really effective tool for better understanding how the co-op and the board are performing beyond just the sort of traditional financial metrics that you might be monitoring.
Great. So another question. At what point after founding, or let's say you're a fairly young co-op that has a fairly hands-on working board, so there's the transition to becoming a more governing board, but so at what point do you recommend them starting the board evaluation process?
A good question. I don't think it's ever too early to start. I think setting, one of the things that you're doing when you're starting a cooperative is, you're starting this business, but you're also establishing kind of the foundation. So you're establishing the foundation of the business and the foundation of the democratic association and some of the like norms and culture and expectations. So I think, getting started early, God knows there's plenty of opportunity for conflict in startups as well. And maybe it's a little bit, it's a survey or an evaluation that has questions that are more appropriate to where you are in the development process. That's maybe a little bit more about, meeting process and interpersonal dynamics and sort of the startup. And some of the tasks that the board is working on in that point in time. So you'd probably want to tailor it to where you are in the development path. But I don't think it's a bad idea to start that practice of self-reflection early in the life of the cooperative.
Do you have any examples of how a board evaluation process impacted board or co-op performance?
Yeah. So one that I'll mention, and this was again, a sort of a unique case. It's a worker co-op, and there were some dynamics on the board where there were some people who had more power within the cooperative who were on the board, and actually it felt like the worker members who were on the board didn't have as much of a voice. And it was something that was hard to talk about without it being personal, because everyone liked each other. And it wasn't necessarily an interpersonal thing. It was like an underlying power dynamic thing, and like who had access to information. So these people who had different roles, more management type roles within the co-op, were also on the board. And it just felt like the worker owners who were on the board who weren't in those positions, it created a dynamic where they didn't feel like they could fully show up and be, always voice their positions on the board. And so it actually led to a change in policy about how many people, like the ratio on the board of people in management, more management positions versus non-management positions. So it led to a direct policy change that was really helpful. And it was one of those conversations that probably it had been an underlying issue for a while, and probably wouldn't have been addressed without that process being in place. I've also seen like meeting practices improved. So people, complaining about like, the interpersonal stuff is actually going really well, but oh my God, we cannot stay focused in meetings. I'm really frustrated. Like, it seems like we never get through our agenda. It seems like we're focusing maybe on the wrong things. So I've also seen, feedback about meeting practices meaningfully change how a board chair is going about their role and sort of thinking through meeting planning. So those are just two examples that are different. Oops, I threw my pen. Those are two very different examples. One is like sort of deep power dynamics, and another is about like how you structure your agenda. But they both were really important for those boards in terms of, having more productive meetings and working relationships.
Great, and we're gonna have to end the Q&A there. So, Courtney, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, so thank you so much. As you can tell, I really like talking about board evaluation. I think it's a really important process, and I'm really glad. And thank you all for joining us to talk about it. You're always welcome to reach out to me or anyone else on our co-op development team. You'll see our merry band there on the slide with our various types of expertise and our email addresses. So you can also find all of that on our website. So please don't hesitate to reach out with co-op development questions, governance questions. We're always happy to chat. And then our next webinar is on May 4th, and that will be a deeper dive into decision-making tools for the boardroom. So last year we did, as part of our Co-ops 101 webinar session, our webinar series, we did a decision-making tools one, and this is going to be a deeper dive into that topic, and Kelly and I will be delivering that one. So join us on May 4th, same time, same place. And yeah, again, just thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this was a useful session for you, and best of luck with your ongoing governance work, and be well.